Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. We are here to talk some Underdog best ball strategy. They have a $100,000 GPP. It's popping off pretty quickly. I got 2 drafts in this morning. Really no wait times, which is great. I wasn't sure what to expect, but you can get right in and get drafted and have a good time. Before we jump into that, I just want to remind you that our NBA package is now live on Establish a Run. Come over to Establish a Run. You can pick up a draft kit for $29.99. Or if you buy an in-season product for $299, you get the draft kit for free. So good deal there. We tried to get as cheap as we could on the in-season package. You're going to get a lot of value. That's 7 months worth of content where we're going to be grinding every damn day. Isn't that right, Drew Dinkmeyer?
Yeah, we'll get a little break when there's an all-star break sometime in March, I guess March 5th through the 10th, that I've already kind of circled on my calendar for some me time. But we are ready to grind. We are excited. We've been pounding away at this draft kit for the last week and a half, getting projections squared away. Mike Gallagher pounding out all the content with his top 150 and sleepers and busts. And of course, we've got underdog rankings on the site. Posted a little tweet under the Established Run NBA account last night about how easy it is to upload our rankings right onto Underdog. They've got a great interface. So if you want to participate in some of these drafts, want to attack this championship, we've got the goods that you need. The rankings are positional scarcity adjusted, which we'll talk about a little bit during the course of this podcast, but is really important when trying to attack this Underdog best ball championship.
Yeah, and I think the setup they have over there really favors the guy that wants to put in the time and do the research and figure out the strategy here. I was drafting some 3-mans last night. I had the baby in hand. I was trying to play poker bros, and I was trying to zoom, and I was trying to draft. And let me tell you, my drafts were not good. And actually, I got a DM on Twitter, said, Makisupa on Underdog, ? And I was like, oh, man, I have to admit to it. It is me. With those teams that have been drafted are not very good. The 3-mans go fast. If you play the championship game, it's 12 people, right, Drew?
Yeah,
or is
12-man leagues.
It's 12.
And the thing that we should note is our Underdog rankings are geared towards those 12-man leagues because positional scarcity does adjust in different league settings in terms of the size. So, our content and our stuff will largely be dedicated to kind of that championship in the 12-man leagues. But thinking through it in 3-man leagues and 6-man leagues, some of the bigs will get a little bit more valuable just because it'll squeeze the player pool to just the top end guys. So just kind of think through those while you're drafting. But that's really the key to kind of working through all this stuff, is figuring out how the format is attached to what you're specifically trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and we'll do a deeper dive, of course, as we go on with this podcast. But positional scarcity is a real thing, and we'll talk a lot more about that. I want to run down the basic setup of the championship. So it's a $25 buy-in. It's a $100,000 prize pool. Do you know what first place is, Drew? Should have pulled that up here.
Yeah, I think it's 25, but I might be wrong on that. I need to double check that.
Yeah, and so look, I mean, DFS it's gotten hard. Let's be real. When you're playing games like this, I think your edge, if you're doing it properly, is significantly larger than playing typical DFS contests. People don't really understand the strategy. They might have a baby in their hand and poker bros going on their phone. There's any type of distraction that can cause them to miss picks or anything. So I really think this is a great opportunity if you want to put in the time. The way this game works is entrants compete in groups over the course of multiple rounds. The tournament's going to have 4 rounds, each of the first 3 rounds consisting of 12-person groups, and the final round will be a single 16-person group. The tournament has 4,608 total entrants, but you know what? I'd kind of be surprised if it fills. So I think there's probably going to be overlay, which is always great. And another thing that you want to be seeking out when you're playing fantasy games, and we just don't see overlay all that often on DraftKings or FanDuel anymore. So when you have an opportunity to take advantage of that, you probably should if you're out here to make money. So that's a total of 384 12-person groups. At the end of round 1, the top 3 performing entries in each group will advance to round 2, and they'll also get a prize. Let's see if I have that down here. Drew put this together.
No, I don't think we have the
below. So
yeah, I don't think we have the prize structure. I didn't copy the whole rule set onto here. But the idea that you get the top 3 get paid out, I think also makes this a little like it's a top heavy GPP. It is 20,000 to first, like most GPPs in tournaments. But the fact that
Okay.
3 people get paid out is a pretty useful concept. I mean, the bottom from 577 to 1152 in terms of the contestants. So the top 3 that don't advance through a couple rounds basically get their money back. So if you can finish in the top
that's
quarter
nice.
of your draft, you're free rolling a shot at the big prize pool.
Yeah, so the next round, 2 people advance and so on and so forth. It's worth noting that each round is 2 weeks. And I was asking Drew, does that make it, if it's 2 weeks, does that mean that certain teams will have an advantage still with their schedule, or will it balance out? And he made the very astute point that we don't have the schedule yet. So we don't know. They're not doing the second half of the schedule until later in the year because they want to build in flexibility in case things go sideways with COVID. So one less thing to worry about, which frankly is kind of nice because I think this format is going to require enough attention as it is. It's worth noting that, like Drew said, it's very top heavy. So that impacts the way that you build your roster. You're going to want to have guys that have more upside. And with NBA, your top players, they just don't have that much variance to them. So you're kind of locking in points with your initial rounds. And then when you get later on, I think you want to swing more for the fences, guys that would benefit from an injury in front of them, or guys whose roles could expand, good per minute type producers. And if they get the opportunity, they could be league winner types. That's what you're thinking, right, Drew?
Yeah, and I think we'll talk a little bit more about this and kind of the similarities between best ball strategies that carry over from football that you might be familiar with football, best ball having a few years on us than NBA. There's a little bit more data that we've been able to dive into and assess. And I think there are some similarities, but I think there are also some key differences. And the stuff around the variance is definitely some of those. So we'll touch on that really in depth in a few minutes here. Why don't we talk about like roster construction in general on this? Because I think it's really interesting.
Before we get to that, let's just note that the scoring, it's points. It's FanDuel / official NBA scoring. So you're not worried about different categories like you would in a typical season-long NBA league. You're just trying to get as much points as possible. And you have 2 starting guards, 2 starting wigs, 1 big and 1 flex, and then you have 10 guys on your bench. So it's pretty deep. But of course, it's going to rotate in and out because it depends on who's playing on a given day. So I don't know how deep your bench is, like how many guys on a full Wednesday. I guess, on a full slate, you'll have a bunch of bench players, but guys towards the bottom of your bench are going to be counting fairly often throughout the week, right?
Yeah, well, so it's going to be the cumulative score of the week for the players. So essentially, like if a player has 4 games versus a player has 3 games, that's the way that it's going to be approached. So I think it's a situation.
Okay, so it's not on a daily basis.
No, it's the week that rounds up things in terms of
that makes more sense.
Score.
So you can completely disregard what I just said about the guys rotating. And I was thinking it would take the highest score on any given day, but in fact it's for the week. So that's interesting to know.
Yeah, so it's basically going to be a situation where you might use those bench players on games where there are weeks that they have 4 games compared to your starters. Your stars have 3. Maybe they can get there, but I think you're going to get a lot of consistent scoring from your stars, assuming we don't have the whole league upended by COVID and it be just a totally different year in terms of the variance with the star players. But generally, even in most fantasy weeks, your 3-game studs are going to outperform your 4-game bench players, which is why we talked about potentially kind of swinging for the fences on some of those bench guys. But I think the interesting thing when you talk about the layout, 2 guards, 2 wings, 1 big, 1 flex, and 10 bench, that means on any given week, you could use in your roster 3 guards, 3 wings, but only 2 bigs. And that's what can constrain some of the positional scarcity stuff. And so when thinking about, the roster spots that you have in terms of 16 rounds for the draft, you've got to figure out what kind of depth do I want to build in at each position. And my thought process on it was basically your base should almost be 6-6-3, 6 guards, 6 wings, 3 bigs. And then you've got 1 extra spot to kind of move around depending on how weak you feel like your position is. And I think this is one of the things that is very similar to NFL best ball drafts in the sense that the early round picks that you make I believe impact your overall roster construction. And as an example, I started a draft with Damian Lillard, Devin Booker, Donovan Mitchell as my first 3 picks. Because I was so strong with those 3 guards, I decided to make that roster construction a 5-8-3, where I only played 5 guards in total. And the idea is if I'm not using 2 of those 3 scores from Lillard, Booker, and Mitchell each and every week, I'm probably not doing well anyway. So I'm going to build in kind of the added upside and a little bit more fragility in my roster because I know I've dedicated a lot of resources to that position early on. And so I think when you're going through these drafts, you want to have in the back of your mind, where am I really strong on my roster and how can I fortify the other positions with depth? Because I have the strength up top at these other positions that I might not need as much depth to contribute because you're only competing for that one flex spot. Everybody past your main starters is just competing for one flex spot. So if you started like Lillard, Booker, Mitchell, and then drafted another like a Drew Holiday or a Bledsoe or something on top of that, now you're automatically counting that one of those guys is not going to do anything for you every single week. And you're building imbalanced rosters. And that's where I think a lot of the edge in this game format is just in understanding roster construction and how to manipulate it through the course of the draft based on where you've spent resources early in the draft.
Yeah, and we've, like Drew said, we've built in positional scarcity into the rankings, but after having done a handful of drafts, I feel like we're still not high enough on the wings. I actually drafted, I have a draft going right now that I just threw on autopilot when we started recording, and it's now got 6 guards, 4 wings, and two centers. And it just keeps drafting more guards. And like, I don't know, man. The wing position just gets really weak really fast. And now, I'm at the end of the draft now, and it's guys like Slow-Mo and Cedi Osman.
Yep.
And
yep. I've been in those waters.
About.
I've been in those waters the last few days. Some Royce O'Neal in there, some Justice Winslow. It's a shaky spot, and so the thing that I'll note about the scarcity is wings are really scarce. Bigs are very deep because you only need to play one of them each and every week. You can get away with 2 or 3 on your roster and be in pretty good shape. And I think that's where most of the edge is right now, is many teams that you're competing against in a given draft, you'll see them draft 4 or 5 bigs. And those guys just can't score points. They don't have a roster spot to do it for them. So I think it makes it so that there's also some good late round bigs available that have good point per minute upside or pretty solid roles that are just undervalued. And so I think waiting on bigs is something that really, really can dictate the way you draft in this. Because if you, and this is hard because like Karl Anthony Towns is such an amazing fantasy scorer and somebody who's going to score a lot of points. Guys like Nikola Jokic and Joel Embiid are guys that you certainly are going to be excited about. Anthony Davis. I mean, Cat and Anthony Davis are 2 consensus top 5 picks in most fantasy categories. We've got Cat ranked 5th in this and Anthony Davis ranked 10th because we've pushed them down a little bit due to positional scarcity. I do feel a little bit better about the guards that last deep. So if I have my preference, if players are similar, I would sort of prefer to take a wing early than a guard or a big.
If you're going really thin on centers, would you consider taking 4? If you get down and you don't have anyone that you can really count on that, but if you get 4, because I'm looking and now it's like Serge Ibaka is left and, sorry, I clicked off my bigs here. Daniel Tice, Rashawn Holmes, Tristan Thompson, DeAndre Jordan. Like these guys, if you have a couple of them and you can pick the best scorers, James Wiseman's there. I feel like you can, Aaron Baines, like, I don't know. There's a lot of guys here that I feel like you can get some solid production from. They're not giving you cat production, but I don't know. It seems like, compared to some of the guards and the wings at this point.
If your first big ends up like Julius Randle, LaMarcus Aldridge, or later type, I think those are situations you might want to reinforce with 4. Depends on who your second big is a little bit, but I think I did have a draft where I went 6-6-4 because I think my second center might have been like Zubats or something like that. And I felt like, okay, I probably need to reinforce these areas a little bit. So I think there are scenarios where you'd go that route. But I don't think I think too many teams that are drafting, like, let's say Cat, and then like Zion, and then John Collins or something like that. Those teams are putting themselves at a huge disadvantage early on because, again, you can only use two of the big scores on any given week.
Let's talk a little bit at the top. Giannis, if you get the first pick, like that's a huge advantage because
such a huge edge.
Yeah, he's so good. He's a wing. And, he's just in a tier of his own there.
The scoring suits him really well too. Like,
yeah, absolutely.
He's great on that official NBA scoring with the steals and the blocks. He's the only guy. You've got LeBron and Tatum as other wings, and maybe Durant, but maybe the only guy in the top 15 that doesn't come with some sort of concern around. Like LeBron, we don't know how much he's going to play this year. Kevin Durant, we think he's going to be healthy in return, but maybe they'll monitor him. Tatum doesn't come with as much concern, but he's just not on the same, per game productive level as Giannis. So getting the number one pick is like, you already are in the driver's seat. If you've got the number one pick, you're just trying not to screw it up.
Yeah. And I think if I'm landing anywhere, probably at, fourth and above, if Tatum is there, I don't know. I prefer Tatum to LeBron, I think. Just feel better about him playing more games and he's younger, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have a preference between the two of them? We have LeBron a little bit ahead.
We have LeBron a little bit ahead, but I also feel a little bit better with Tatum. It's a little bit of a gut feel thing. The projecting LeBron's games is just difficult. We do know that on a per game basis, LeBron should outscore Tatum. Tatum would have to take a pretty big step forward, or LeBron a big step back, for that not to be the case, just from what we've seen even the last year. So I lean Tatum as well, but I get into the spot where I think the top three are pretty clear with Giannis, Harden, and Luka. I think Harden and Luka, you can argue, are splitting hairs. I think Giannis is clearly ahead of them. And then I think the next tier gets confusing because it's a tier that I'd rather pick seventh or eighth than I would fourth, because fourth, you just feel like you're reaching on whoever you want to take. The guy who goes there based on underdog ADP is usually Anthony Davis or Karl Anthony Towns. And as we've talked about with the positional scarcity, that becomes a real challenge in terms of lineup building.
Yeah, absolutely. I've found that Siakam has landed on, I think pretty much every team I've drafted. Is he your favorite in that second round? Or, maybe Durant's got a little bit more upside there and maybe it's worth just swinging for the fences on him. What's your thought in that range?
Well, what was happening, when Underdog first released these drafts, Stephen Curry was like 30th in their ADP. And so you could get like Steph in like the middle or late second round. That was really fun in terms of shooting for the moon in terms of upside. But obviously the wing scarcity makes it so that you feel a little bit better about your roster builds when you get your hands on someone like a Durant, someone like a Paul George, Kawhi Leonard, Siakam, those types of wings in that range, because it's a little bit of a dip after that. Then you get into the Zach LaVine, Jimmy Butler, we've got DeMar DeRozan, and you can see how things start to fall off
Ingram,
pretty quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas before you know it, you're looking at Andrew Wiggins and Oubre, and they're the 20th ranked wing, so it gets there quickly.
Yeah, and so you at that same point in the draft, you're looking at, like, on the guard side, D'Angelo Russell, Donovan Mitchell, like Chris Paul, guys you feel pretty darn good about. So the wings are really challenging if you can get your hands on them. Durant's been starting to go a little bit earlier, like late first even. So I think it's hard to get your hands on him at a spot that you feel really good about. And that's one of the challenges. I would say anytime that a wing or a big is naturally at the top of my draft board, I get pretty excited that I'm getting really good value on them, because I know we're pumping up wings in terms of the positional scarcity. I know the bigs are kind of coming down, but the rest of the league is drafting them at the right way, usually, or at an aggressive way. Usually I find at my draft board while I'm going through as our rankings update, I'm usually finding guards at the very top. And that's why if you do go on auto draft, you might end up start filling out the guard spots a little bit earlier. But I would say that second round, Siakam's a guy that I've felt like I've gotten pretty fair value on. Paul George, a guy that I feel like I get pretty fair value on at times and I'm comfortable with. But also you'll see like Booker and Beal start to drop off. Beal's ADP is starting to slide a little bit with this Russell Westbrook trade.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's useful to look at, if you go to our rankings on Established Run, we have the difference between where we have them ranked and what their ADP is. I mean, Durant, for instance, right now, his ADP is 8.4, and we have him ranked at 15th, and that's even including the bump up for the position. So he's not a guy you're likely to get on your team, and I have not gotten him yet. LeBron, on the other hand, his ADP is 10.6, and we have him ranked at 6. So he's a guy you'll probably get a lot. Tatum's pretty much fair value. But yeah, that kind of makes sense.
LeBron versus Durant LeBron versus Durant is an interesting one. Where do you land on that? I feel pretty good about LeBron over Durant.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, I guess I'm just trying to understand, when you get down towards the end here and these guys, when they miss a game, so you have 2 games of LeBron and then you have 3 games of a lesser player. Like, that just seems really killer. If you, and it seems like him and Durant will miss enough games that they'll probably have a lot of weeks where they're missing 1 game.
Yeah,
it's kind of, I don't know, man. It makes me uncomfortable.
We have some replacement value built into these best ball ranks, so it's not just straight games. And the reason we do that is that's regressing a little bit of our projections on the games played, and not giving full weight that we know exactly how many games everybody's going to play before the season starts. Because otherwise, if we didn't regress that at all, you would have just the most durable, the players we think are the most durable, kind of flooding at the very top, and it would create a big segregation in the back half of the draft as well. So we've included a little bit of replacement value to kind of regress some of that.
I guess the point I'm trying to make is that these guys that are going to be subjected to load management, it's actually, they're worth a little bit less than guys who might just get hurt and miss games in a row. Because if you lose a whole week, whatever. But when you're having a bunch of weeks where you lose that game, that's not great. So,
yeah.
But man, there's so many guys that are going to have load management, especially, I don't know. And you mentioned earlier, like, COVID could throw everything for a loop. I mean, I almost think that should be the baseline, based on what we're seeing in the NFL and how aggressive they've been with things, and it's starting to spiral there. And we're talking about an indoor game as COVID continues to increase, and I think they're going to have to sit out longer in the NBA. Am I correct on that?
Yes.
I think I saw 12 days, which is longer than the NFL. So it just seems like you almost have to plan for some chaos, but I'm not quite sure how you best do that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
So the thoughts that I would have is how you think about kind of the back end of the draft. And this is where it gets a little bit of a push and pull between strategies. What we had talked about initially was the idea that because there's lower variance compared to the NFL on your high round players, that the ability to take big swings in the late rounds is probably easier on the roster's floor in basketball than it is in football. But you throw in the COVID variable on top and you wonder, okay, now what kind of variance level are we dealing with the top end players in basketball compared to the top end players in football? And I don't know. What that would do, though, is if it starts to get more along the lines of football, then you might want to use those late round picks on guys whose roles are a little bit more solidified. I think in general, though, kind of the ideal late round pick is somebody who has a role, but maybe not a full role. Maybe they're projecting for 22 to 24 minutes. But in the right scenario, if they play better and they improve and they take their game to the next level, if somebody on their roster falls by the wayside, either due to COVID or due to injury, they can ascend into a 28 to 32 minute role. And now you're getting better per minute production. And so some of the guys that I think of when I think of that, like Chris Boucher is a guy that comes up for me almost immediately. Like, I think Aaron Baines is probably going to start and play that Gasol role. And I think Chris Boucher is probably going to play the Serge Ibaka role in Toronto. And if Baines gets hurt, if there's COVID, whatever, I think there's a chance that Boucher could get up to like the 28 minute per night and 30 minutes per game type situation. And then he's a smash. He'd be going where like Christian Wood is going in these drafts. And so I think maybe those guys are like the best combination of guys, but there's not that many of them. I mean, people are on to trying to draft for upside in general. I end up finding myself like finishing out rosters a lot of times with guys that I think have pretty stable roles in thin rosters to compete with them, like Royce O'Neal, Jetty Osman, where I think they're pretty stable, but these guys aren't their skill sets aren't that they can really ascend into something else. And I think those guys are maybe a little bit more valuable in a higher variance kind of COVID environment.
Yeah, two guys that are jumping out when I'm sorting by ETR rank versus ADP would be the guards in Detroit, DeLon Wright and Killian Hayes. And I mean, it just seems like a lock. And this is probably why they're projecting well, because I'm sure we're building in Derrick Rose missing games, right? We have to be.
Yeah. And I mean, just Derrick Rose just kind of managing minutes. And they also said that they're going to play 3 guards together. So like there's minutes for all these guys to be successful. I mean, even Derrick Rose projects well for us relative to ADP. It's a situation where it's a situation where the uncertainty around the roster and people generally don't like to draft guys on bad teams, right? I think young guys on bad teams are great targets because they can ascend into more opportunity, and they're unlikely to be the candidates that late in the season, if the team is selectively choosing which players they want to play and get looks at and resting guys, they aren't the ones that are likely to have that occur. And I do think the lottery ball situation changing in the NBA has also less de-incentivized teams from like full out tanking. You've seen like Charlotte sign Gordon Hayward. You've seen, Detroit go after Jeremy Grant and Plumlee, and some of these teams that, maybe they'd be better off in the past, taking the year off and increasing their lotto ball odds. The flatter lotto ball structure, I think, is encouraging teams to try to build for now.
Yeah, another guy that really jumps out here is one of Gallagher's boys this year, and that's Darius Baisley. He's a wing, of course, and his ADP is 121. We've got him ranked at 84, and that's a guy whose role I think could be bigger than
some of those ADPs that the thing that I'd mention is they're going to move quickly. I've already seen it in terms of the last day or two since we've released our underdog best ball rankings, and they're so easy to upload. I've seen there's a couple users that I can already tell are going straight off and straight down our rankings. And so I've got a running list, so I know who I'm drafting against, so I can kind of maybe manipulate the positional stuff to get the types of guys that I want. But I think some of these ADBs are going to correct relatively quickly. And I'm not sure how frequently Underdog is going to be updating their API that updates the ADPs for our feed. So Baisley, he's already on the move where, you're probably now looking at him in like round 8-ish. He's already starting to move up. So some of these guys, they're on the move already.
I believe it's a rolling 2-week average. I'm not sure on that.
Yeah.
But you made a great point there about paying attention to the people that you're drafting against. If a lot of these guys if you're doing more than a few of these, you're going to see the same people over and over. And if you know that they're using established run rankings, that can change your strategy because you can kind of pinpoint who they're going to take when they're coming up in front of you. So that's a great point there. Let's talk some other strategies here as far as, stacking, of course, is a huge thing that people do in NFL. How are we dealing with that? I almost wonder if it's, in some sense, it's a good thing because if teams get a good schedule down the stretch, you take advantage of that. But then the flip side is that if you have good players on the same team that aren't correlated, which sometimes they can be, a lot of times they're not in the NBA, then you're just taking production away from the other guys. So if I was drafting Brandon Ingram, I wasn't going to draft Zion. At least that's the way I was approaching it. It's like, well, with Ingram, I'm hoping actually that Zion misses some games and then Ingram's a lot better in that situation. So how are you dealing with guys on the same team?
Yeah, I think stacking is obviously something that you want to implement in NFL, but is really tough to implement appropriately in NBA. I do think there might be some situations where teams that don't have a lot of depth on their roster, and so the fantasy positions might not necessarily compete quite as much with one another, because you could run into a situation where these teams get stripped of their depth entirely, and now you've got a few guys who are playing 34 minutes a night. Those guys can, even if they don't necessarily correlate on a per possession basis with each other, they can still have correlation in terms of better game environments or a better schedule, allowing them to play more minutes than some of the other teams on the field. So situations where I think that could happen are like the Knicks, Detroit. I think some of these rosters are interesting, especially the Knicks with Thibodeau, just given how he's been in the past. And it's kind of hard to work through who are going to be the guys now. But I think, RJ Barrett, Mitchell Robinson, Julius Randle, Mitch and Julius are tough because they're both bigs in this format, and they do compete with each other for stats a little bit. But maybe Alec Burks, Elfrid Payton, maybe some of those guys. I think there could be some value there because if you run into the right mix of Thibodeau playing these guys 34 minutes a night, you could get some added value there. Detroit, I think, is that type of roster as well. Killian Hayes or DeLon Wright or even both is viable with Plumlee or Jeremy Grant. I think those things are interesting, but it's not the clear correlation that NFL is. It's really not the same thing. And the thing that you have to be cognizant of, though, is in terms of the variance being a little bit higher with COVID, that could make stacks more valuable. It just makes them more variant. Like you could get a team schedule pushed off because of COVID and like reworked. And if that were to happen, you might have a situation where some teams are just having a lot more games in a particular week than other teams. You could get like some teams that have 4 or 5 games in a week and another team has 2. And so I think the problem is we just have no idea how to plan for it. So I would say that in general, the way that I think about it with teammates is if I have 2 teammates that are, if I'm between 2 players and I already have a teammate of that player, I think, can these 2 players benefit together and what scenario would it benefit together? So like an example was in one draft, I had taken Josh Richardson early. And I was sitting there looking at a wing between like Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal was around like my pick area. And I decided to choose Dorian Finney-Smith because I thought, okay, yes, Josh Richardson and Dorian Finney-Smith aren't necessarily going to correlate well together. But what if Luka got hurt? What if Kristaps sits out more of the season than possible? We've seen Dallas willing to play their guys big minutes, and we know Dallas plays fast. So I think there's routes to those 2 benefiting each other, even if they don't correlate on a per possession basis. And so maybe I won't go like 4 guys from the same team, but sometimes in situations I am open to kind of making those pairs. I think Shai Gilgeous-Alexander and Baisley are an interesting pair. I think sometimes these getting like teammates is interesting. And then on the flip side, I've done it the other way where like one draft I ended up with DeRozan and LaMarcus Aldridge because they just kept falling in terms of values. And I'm not super excited about that pairing because I don't like the Spurs are so actively talking about playing faster and playing different. And I think it's going to mean a lot of, those 2 separated on the court, DeRozan and Aldridge, to try to have them be like the one scoring option that's slower with faster guys around them. And so I'm trying to think through the pairings in terms of how they interact with one another and what the ultimate upside is.
We talked a little bit about zero center approach, but just, closing thought on that. Just the more I think about it, I like it just because, Boucher is way down there. It's just a lot of guys, Wendell Carter Jr. It seems like with 3 or maybe 4 of those guys, you could get not to the elite level, but you're doing pretty good. And then you can worry about wings more. So I don't know, that might end up being a popular approach, but it seems to make a lot of sense to me.
We'll see. It's not right now. Right now, teams are overdrafting the bigs, and that's really where the edge is right now. We'll see where that evolves over time. But yeah, I like, late round guys that I like, Boucher, Mason Plumlee. Those guys you can get in like 14, 15, and they're fine as your third center.
All right. Well, we've covered a lot. I mean, this is definitely a complex game, but I think that's a good thing because if you put in the time, you're going to have a big edge here. So I like it. I think a lot of you guys can make some money doing this. Do you have any closing thoughts on just the game or the strategy?
The big thing that I'd recommend is just thinking through your roster builds as you go based on how much capital you have allocated to a specific position. And the more capital intense your rosters are at a specific position, the fewer extra bench guys you should be considering at that position down the road. So if you start really guard heavy and you're letting the draft come to you in terms of value and everybody's drafting wings and bigs, that's okay. But just recognize that you might not want 6 guards on those types of rosters. Same thing with wings. If you start off really wing heavy and you've got like 4 really strong wings, you might not want 7 or 6 wings on that team. And so just think through and be flexible in terms of adapting your strategy to the roster build that you've drafted. Because if a bunch of people go in there with our ranks, there's like, if we all went in there with the same ranks, the people who would differentiate each other and give a better chance to win are the ones who would get the roster structure right. And so just the ranks themselves are not kind of the the end all be all for being successful in this format. You really need to pay attention and craft that roster structure throughout the draft.
All right, there you have it. And if you have not signed up at Underdog yet, what are you doing? Get over there. You can use promo code ETR. There's no deposit bonuses there, but what that will get you is in a drawing for some ETR swag. So it's better than nothing, and we'd appreciate giving us, the nod over there if you heard about it through us. So, all right, we will be back on Monday, and we're going to be joined by Justin Fan from Fantasy Labs. We're going to be talking win totals, so that should be a really fun one. Make sure you join us for that. So thanks for listening, guys, and we will see you then.